Welcome back, everybody. We're about to start our second session of the evening, and like we said, that this is a series of four great guest lectures by incredible experts who I saw in the comments some people congratulating us for actually just having Black women as the speakers and as people who are the experts, and with women leading, it is indeed a wonderful thing to see. And with that, thank you again to Dr. Nyaraza, who gave us a thrilling lecture on vaccines. I didn't think there would be a day where I would sit in a lecture about vaccines and be as excited as I was today. So I'm expecting to even be more excited as Dr. Jenniffer also takes us through what global policies and global access means in the context of COVID-19 vaccines. But before she begins her lecture, I'd just like to read a short bio by Dr. Jenniffer Maroa, who heads up the genetics program at the Human Heredity and Health in Africa, and at the African Human Clinical Trials portfolio of the African Academy of Sciences, known as the AAS. Prior to joining AAS, Dr. Maroa spent 16 years doing HIV-1 clinical research. She investigated a host immune responses in mother-to-child transmission of HIV-1 with a focus on breast milk transmission, and explored antibody evolution in natural HIV-1 infections with the goal of informing antibody-based vaccine designs. That is Dr. Jenniffer Maroa, who is about to give us another thrilling lecture. Dr. Jenniffer, go right ahead.
Okay, and thank you very much, Pado, for that very kind welcome. And thank you again to African Alliance for giving me this opportunity to present this lecture. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. I'm excited to be here, and I will share what I have, but I'm also looking forward to learning from you as much as possible. And as you've heard, I was invited to speak about the global access of COVID-19 tools, specifically vaccines, and maybe allude to drugs and treatments briefly, but really the focus is on vaccines. And this is because currently, this is all we are talking about. It's our hope to get us out of our homes where we've been locked for the last several months. So I was lucky to join the previous conversation, and I, listened a little bit to the tail end of it. And I know that you've discussed a lot about how vaccines are developed and all. And I'm not sure if you covered this, but this is where I wanted to start us today, just to make sure that we are on the same page. So when, maybe I should ask, I hope that people can hear me.
Yes, Doc, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. So, so when we have vaccines and vaccinations, or when there is a disease and we are talking about vaccines and vaccinations, what are the ethical goals that we need to be having in mind? Or what are the ethical goals that we have in mind that we should make sure that we accomplish at the end of the entire exercise? And the one and most important one that we all are aware of is we want to be able to reduce morbidity and mortality. So to reduce the impact of the disease on the individual's health and the community as a whole. So that's our first goal when we are talking about vaccines and vaccinating people. But over and above that, we also want to minimize the impact of this disease on the existing societal infrastructure and the economy. And I think COVID-19 kind of gives us a very good basis to discuss this, because with the lockdowns and people not being able to go out and just to vent for themselves their daily bread, it becomes very difficult. And if this continues for much longer, systems will start breaking down, the infrastructure will start breaking down. We know that countries are already struggling economically because of the lockdowns, which meant that a lot of different aspects of fields like, hotel and industry had to be closed because, there were no flights, there's no more tourism, and so on and so on. We can give a lot more examples on that. And then finally, it would be unethical if we had a vaccine and did not make sure that it's equally distributed globally. And that means that we need to be able to bridge any health inequalities that exist. If we have a vaccine, we have to make sure that it's distributed to all groups of people, disadvantaged groups, poor countries, poor people in conflict areas. It doesn't matter, but if there's a vaccine and it's working, it's the only ethical thing that we have to do is to make sure that it reaches everyone at the right time to save their lives. So with that in mind, then we think about global access to COVID-19 vaccines. What exactly are we talking about? When we talk about equitable access, what does that mean? I mean, we talk about equitable access to many things, to resources, to education. In this case, we are talking about global access to a vaccine. It's simply a fair process that is in place that everybody understands. And this fair process needs to pay attention to the fact that this vaccine will be affordable, safe, and effective in the people that we are sending it to, and it should get to them in a timely fashion so that we can avert any deaths that can be prevented by a vaccine. So those are the things that we need to be thinking about. It has to be affordable, it has to be safe, it has to be effective, and it has to reach the populations on time to save their lives. So then with that in mind, then the other question we had asked ourselves is, what are the factors that might affect the success? Now, in most cases, we always focus on, when we're talking about access, we all focus on cost, and it's crucial. I mean, you need to be able to afford these things, but cost is not the only thing that can influence whether people have access to a vaccine or not. We need to be able to distribute them. We need to be able to actually deliver them, and the communities have to be able to uptake. So there needs to be a positive attitude and or interest within communities to be part of the vaccine and vaccination exercise. So I'm going to cover these 4 different factors in my next few slides, and then I will stop there and we can have a conversation before I present the rest of the slides at the very end of the conversation. So why is it then that this is something that we have to discuss? Because we've already seen that it's the ethical thing to do. When you have a vaccine against any disease, you need to be able to distribute it to everyone so that everybody benefits. But we are discussing this in this meeting because it's a problem. Access to resources is usually a problem. We know that. And I will give a couple of examples here. For those of us who are in the HIV field and have had conversations around antiretroviral therapy, we know that even if the first drugs for antiretroviral therapy that were against HIV that worked were approved by the FDA here in the United States as early as 1997, it took over a decade plus for these particular drugs to actually be accessible to dying patients in the African continent, for example. And, there were lots of excuses that were given. Oh, the African people will not know how to manage the regimens. They're complicated. They're going to lead to viral resistance because they won't use them well, or the governments don't have the money to buy these drugs at the right price. And with all these excuses, we wasted so much time and so many people died who would have been saved by the provision of this antiretroviral therapy. So, access has been a problem before. Now, moving from drugs, we can also talk about childhood mortalities. We know that children still die in low and middle income countries from what we call vaccine preventable diseases. The previous speaker talked about polio and measles, and these diseases that we have vaccines that work, and we know that if we have our children vaccinated against these diseases, they will not die from these diseases. Even if they were infected, they would be able to deal with these infections and still be fine. But children still die. And in particular, towards the end of the 20th century, it was recognized that the global immunization efforts were declining because a lot of countries could simply not afford to buy the vaccines, even if they were available. So then to be able to distribute them to the children in their countries. So about 30 million children in poor countries were not getting immunized. And this is a problem. So recognizing this, a number of different agencies came together and they formed what we now call the Global Alliance for Vaccine Immunization, or in short, Gavi. And this was formed in 2000 with a lot of funding, over 700 million, I believe, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to get them off the ground. And their goal is really to save lives, reduce poverty, and protect the world against any threat of epidemics. And I think it's important to give credit to Gavi because so far they've been able to help in immunizing over 800 million children. And with that, we've saved over 14 million lives. So you can see here that if the vaccines are available and people can't afford them, then it's useless because people are still gonna die. So we need to make sure that when vaccines are available, everybody can afford them and can have access to them. So then that begs the question, why are vaccines and other products so expensive? I'm sure you're probably asking yourself that question. And the reason why the medical care products can be very expensive is because of the costs that go into developing drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines. It requires a lot of research. This research is very costly, requiring a high-level, high-tech infrastructure and human resources. It takes a very long time for what we call a hit, or something that we think could make a drug, for example, or a vaccine, to go from, as you can see here, the discovery to being approved at the end of the arrow over here. And there are many, many attempts that have to be made along the way with many, many products, or rather candidates. And a lot of those candidates, actually about 70% of those candidates, drop somewhere along this journey. As you can see here, this is a valley of death. So something might start off here very well, and we think we are very excited, it's a good target, but by the time it gets into the manufacturing process, it drops off because maybe it didn't show the features that we were anticipating. And so only very few make it to the very end of phase 3 clinical trials and eventually to be approved. And you can see time here and appreciate that, this initial process could take up to 8 years. This middle process here could take up to 10 years, and another 2 years for the regulatory review and approval. So in total, the amount of time and funding that goes into it, investments that go into the process are really high. And that is why by the time drugs and vaccines are coming out on the other end, they are very expensive. I'm not in any way saying that pharmaceutical companies are entitled to inflating prices for drugs and making it impossible for countries and people to afford them. What I'm just giving you today is the picture of what actually happens and why some of these things are the way they are. So recognizing that that might be a problem in the context of COVID-19, in March of 2020, WHO, the European Commission, and France launched what we call the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This is a global collaboration to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access of COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. And we've been in this game for a while now to recognize that it takes all the key stakeholders for us to actually be able to have a meaningful conversation and move together as one coherent, organized group when we want to solve a problem. That's why you see here, you can appreciate that the key stakeholders that are part of this group is very diverse. You have governments, global health organizations, the manufacturers themselves, scientists, private sector, civil society, and philanthropies, so that we can have good conversations and people can actually try to understand what's going on as we move forward. And so the ACT or the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator Program has 3 pillars, and the third pillar is the vaccine pillar, which is also called COVAX for COVID vaccine. And basically, as we've said, it is to accelerate the development and manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines and to guarantee an equitable access globally. It is co-led by Gavi. This is one of the reasons why I took time to talk about Gavi initially, and an organization called CEPI. And CEPI is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which was formed, I believe, after the Ebola outbreak in 2014 to expedite innovations during epidemics, and of course, WHO, which I believe most of us are very familiar with. So, to the best of my knowledge, COVAX is the one truly global facility that is bringing together countries from both the north and the south, so low and middle income countries, together with the rich countries, to think about the global access of COVID vaccines. So the COVAX facility aims to make sure that participating countries can access COVID-19 vaccines quickly, fairly, and safely as possible. So the question then is, how does this work? So the way it's organized is that they're trying to put together a pot of money or funding. So rich countries can put money into the pot, funded low and middle income or poor countries can put money into the same pot if they have the money, or they can sign up to say they would need support or will need funding. And then the COVAX facility works with pharmaceutical companies to support the research, development, and manufacturing. We've already talked about that very expensive exercise and process of developing vaccines. So COVAX facility will work with pharmaceutical companies and be like partners with them in that process. And by partnering, it allows them the advantage of negotiating the pricing when a product is finally approved. So COVAX then is acting nicely as an intermediary between the different countries and the manufacturers to negotiate an affordable price that then we can be able to distribute the drugs rather the vaccines to both the rich countries and the funded countries. The last time I checked, there were 190 countries that had signed up. Previously, with the Trump administration, the United States was not one of the countries, but with the Biden administration, they are signing up and they have committed to supporting COVAX, which means there will be a little bit more funding that can then be used for the countries that cannot afford. And then the COVAX aims to deliver about 2 billion vaccine doses by the end of this year. So it's quite ambitious, but we do hope and believe that they will make it. And it's interesting to note that about 1.3 billion of these doses will go to the funded countries or to low and middle income countries. And some of the vaccines that they're working with, I don't know whether the previous presenter got into this, are the 3 main ones that we keep talking about recently are the Pfizer, Moderna, and the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines, which have all been approved and are already being used in some of the countries around the world. And the plan, the latest information from COVAX is that they are really trying to make sure that their first doses through COVAX can be accessed as early as February, which is next month. Over and above just making sure that countries can access the vaccine, the COVAX facility has also come up with a framework on how to deliver these vaccine doses because they are limited initially. We know that we have to, it's a huge number of doses that we will need to produce for us to cover the entire world. So they've come up with the framework, and the first, as you can see here, we have what they're calling the Tier 1 group. And this includes the healthcare providers, the people over the age of 65 and people under the age of 65 with underlying conditions. And this really takes us back to this first slide again that we talked about what are the ethical goals of a vaccine or vaccination exercises. So we want to make sure we vaccinate healthcare providers so that we actually have people within the healthcare system to help any other people that might fall sick. We don't want healthcare systems to become empty just because the healthcare providers who are frontline workers and getting exposed every day, if they become infected and have to take time off or we lose them through death, then it means that the entire world will be suffering because we won't have the right experts in the right place to take care of those of us who are not healthcare providers. So we need to protect them. And then the people over the age of 65, there has been enough research that has been done. And so far, we do know that if people over the age of 65 get infected, their risk of dying from the SARS-CoV-2 infection or the COVID-19 disease is much higher than people under the age of 65. And then the people that are under 65 but have other underlying conditions also have an increased risk of death. So you can appreciate why this group of people is falling under tier 1, and that is COVAX and the COVAX facility are paying attention to that, and they're saying, we are going to send out the first 20% of the population needs to be protected, and these are the vulnerable people, and this needs to be protected or vaccinated, so to speak, before the end of 2021, so that we can be sure that the vulnerable population is taken care of. It's also advantageous to do that because if you have fewer people that are at risk of dying and fewer people that are at risk of acquiring the disease, then it means that we'll have less community transmissions over time. But we also have to appreciate the fact that these populations are going to vary from one country to another. For example, when we talk about Africa, it has the youngest population globally with a median age of about 20. In fact, some people alluded to the fact that maybe this is why the first wave of COVID-19 was not as impactful on the continent as was anticipated, which is a good thing for us. And so then it means that maybe African countries might have slightly more doses to play around with, and they might want to think about a tier 1B, for example, of the people that they would want to vaccinate if they have extra doses after they've vaccinated the tier 1 group above. But that's going to depend on different countries, obviously. And then the COVAX facility has also said that they will have additional doses. So over and above the 2 billion that I've talked about, depending on the funding going forward, there's going to be more doses that will be available, and countries are still being encouraged to sign up to COVAX so that they can continue to receive these vaccines into for the next few years. The thing is that going forward, the risk of different countries is going to vary, as we've said, depending on age, genetic factors, climate, environment, so many things will affect the risk. And by the risk here, we are talking about how many people are likely to get infected and how are the healthcare systems doing and so on, other things. And COVAX will consider those things as it distributes the vaccines to both the rich and the funded countries, so to speak. And as again, just emphasizing here that they will pay attention to the potential impact of COVID-19 to the country, and also how well the healthcare system is doing and or coping. As we said, we don't want our healthcare systems to collapse. We have to make sure that we maintain those. And also not forgetting that people are still, suffering from other ailments over and above COVID-19 that we continuously need to be paying attention to. People still need to be treated for other diseases. HIV patients need to be taken care of. They need to receive their medication. So we need to make sure that our healthcare systems don't break down. And all that will be put into consideration as COVAX is distributing the vaccines across the globe. And importantly, they do have a reserve of about 5% of the vaccines, which they say they will secure this for as a humanitarian buffer. So these are vaccine doses that are set aside to be sent to hard to reach areas or areas in conflict. So as we said previously, it is ethical for us to make sure that everybody, wherever you may be, wherever they may be, they are able to receive this vaccine. So there will be that provision of about 5% of doses that will be set aside to reach the hard to reach or conflict areas. So in summary, what we've covered so far is the fact that cost can prohibit access, but in the context of COVID-19, there's this setup of COVAX, which is a global endeavor to make sure that once the vaccines are available, they are at an affordable price that people across the globe and countries across the globe can actually be afford and to buy and for their people. So I want to take questions if there are any before we proceed. Unless people don't have questions, or unless we want to take questions at the end, I seek your advice.
Doctor, there is one question here from Uthman Aliu Ajanuka, and he's asking, apart from COVID-19, does the vaccine cure any other diseases in the body? That's the first question. The second one is around access. Are there any like political insinuations around COVAX, and why has it also been criticized so much? The third question that we have so far, Dr. Maroa, is the funded countries will be in debt with the US, or will it be a donation will the funded countries be in debt with the US, or will it be a donation from all countries?
Yeah, so I'll take the last question first. No, this is more a humanitarian activity, so no countries are getting into debt by being part of COVAX or getting vaccines from COVAX. And then the next question was around the political nature of it. I think this is something that comes up every time there are issues around whether it's healthcare, or as I mentioned, like in the HIV example also, people tend to politicize pretty much everything. From where I sit, and these are my personal reflections on how COVAX is working, I believe that it's an open space. Any countries are allowed to sign up, and once you sign up, you will be part of the group, and therefore you will be able to receive the vaccines that will go through COVAX. But inevitably people will politicize things, and I don't really want to comment onto the political nature of these things per se. What I believe is that it is an open space. All countries, I haven't heard of a country that wanted to sign up and was denied that fact of signing up to COVAX, and that's what I think would raise eyebrows for most of us. Over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maroa, for that. There's one other question before you move on. What are the preventative measures that are ground to stop people that might be likely to produce fake vaccines in order to make money? And another question around the African Union has recently criticized COVAX facility. What were the reasons behind their criticism?
So, to the first question in terms of producing of fake vaccines, yeah, that's a good question, and sometimes it's difficult for anybody to police everybody else around the globe. But what I would say with regard to that is that all the vaccines that are going through clinical trials are publicized. So, there are databases that you can go to and check to see, what vaccines have gone through which trial, which phase of the trial, and so on and so forth. So you can find this data. It's in openly available databases. But also over and above that, there has to be an approval process, as we saw on that timeline, which I quickly went through. It's not just, that here is something that works. Once you have the data that is, you can prove to the regulators that it actually works. The regulators have to sit down and actually give approval for that. And so the thing is, if a vaccine has not been approved by a recognized regulatory body, then that should not be in the market. But again, I know that even as I say that, I know that even as on our everyday today lives, we have fake drugs penetrating into the African continent. So I think for me, this is more of a question and a problem with African governments, for example, that need to have more stringent rules on what can come into the country and what cannot come into the country. So our national regulatory agencies and pharmacy and boards like that need to be in the forefront to make sure that we don't get any fake vaccines or drugs. And it doesn't necessarily really have to be just COVID, whether it's for malaria or HIV or anything like that. But when systems are not stringent enough, and when we don't implement some of the guidelines that we have, these are issues that are likely to happen. And then in the context of the African Union and COVID, again, I don't really want to get into the politics of it, but what I would say is that African governments and any other countries are allowed to join COVAX. And over and above that, I think it's important for us to recognize that you don't necessarily have to wait for COVAX. The governments are also encouraged to have a bilateral conversation with pharmaceutical manufacturing companies to obtain these vaccines, which means you can, a country like, Malawi, for example, can just simply have a conversation directly with AstraZeneca and purchase X number of doses. The only challenge with that is that it would be very pricey, as we said, because going through COVAX just minimize. It's like an insurance company or a broker that will help in terms of negotiating for the price. But when you go on your own, obviously, as we always know, it's going to be more expensive. So I think we need to appreciate the fact that if countries are not willing to go in through the COVAX process, they can always go in through by having bilateral conversations with these manufacturers, except they're going to have to pay more.
So much, Dr. Maroa. I think there are no further questions for now, so you can go on.
Yeah, so let's proceed then and very quickly just look at what are the other things that might influence delivery or access of vaccines. And as we said, securing the vaccine in itself is not enough. Countries must be prepared to receive these vaccines and to deploy them. And to my right here, you see a really nice schematic that shows how the vaccine cold chain works. So for example, if we had to buy vaccines from Europe and we are shipping them to a country in Africa, these vaccines have to be transported in a cold storage on the flight to the destination. Then they have to be stored within a cold storage within that country's, main airport, for example. Then we have to have a truck, a cold refrigerated truck that can be able to go and collect this, collect the vaccines from the cold room and then distribute them to probably, regional storage centers, for example. And then now local governments must have, a car or that is also refrigerated or that can carry cold storage for products or equipment that they will then use to distribute this vaccine from the regional cold storage rooms to even further until we get to the last mile. Now, this process is very expensive, so to speak, and most countries don't have this already developed to an extent that we actually require them to be, especially now for COVID-19. And I know that Gavi in its activities has been able to develop some of these processes in low and middle income countries, and that will be leveraged upon. But it would be nice if into the future, given what we are learning now, these processes and this infrastructure can be put in place. You know, it would be nice if individuals didn't have to, you know, go even further, because as you can see, for us to reach what we call the last mile, sometimes it needs somebody to carry this on a motorbike or on a bicycle to take it to the very last mile of the countries for people to actually receive the vaccines. And the challenging thing with the vaccines that we are dealing with right now is the fact that both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine have to be transported in frozen. So they need to be frozen. The Pfizer one at -70, the Moderna one at -20, which means that this is going to be a challenge for some countries to deal with. But also once they get to the lab, they need to be refrigerated at 2 to 8 degrees. You know, this is the normal fridge temperature, so that might not be a problem. But getting them in these cold frozen temperatures to the sites might be a challenge going forward. So that in itself might cause a problem and lead to inaccessibility. And then once we have gotten it to the cold storage, it doesn't mean that we are done with the process. We need to have the right supplies that go with vaccines for us to be able to do this. This includes appreciating that the healthcare units have to have the cold storage facilities that we've talked about. We need human resources, as we've said, our nurses who have been working very, very hard through this pandemic, and doctors and everyone else. We appreciate them, acknowledge them, and we know that we will need them into the future. So they need to be there. We need to have members that can actually document that people have received these vaccines, and we can track that into the future. Over and above that, we've been talking about PPE, so personal protective equipment, and you know, we need to provide that for our nurses and doctors so that they can actually be able to do the job that they need to do. Again, even if the vaccine gets to the fridge in that clinic in the last mile, if they don't have the syringes and gloves and needles and face shield and mask for them to actually do the job, it's going to be hard for them to be able to do the job. And then finally, we need to have community interest. And I think this is what some of what the last speaker was speaking about when I joined, talking about the role of the community and acknowledging the importance of vaccines and making sure that we actually go out there and take the vaccines when our time comes. We need this positive attitude. And I totally understand where we are coming from, because history, there are historical things that we can look at and be like, no, we can't trust, you know, this or that. But being able to tease out what is truth from the lies is going to be what is going to help us move forward. And it's unfortunate that, you know, the pandemic is here during a time of social media, where, you know, information travels really quickly, and so there's a lot of false information that can get around. But really, our responsibilities as within our own communities to understand what is true and false, and speak to our community members to uptake the vaccines. And I also just wanted to allude to the fact that the three vaccines that are available right now, so Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, they all require 2 shots. And that's a problem. It's a problem because, you know, sometimes some people are moving around, some people are homeless, and you don't know where you're going to find them. Some people are in conflict areas, you know, and you're not so sure where you're going to find them. So it's going to be a challenge for us to be able to document and make sure that everybody actually receives their 2nd shot, which is important, because that's the only time we can actually say that that person is protected. And so even as we deal with these challenges, it's really up to all of us as community to accept and speak to our people to uptake the vaccines when that time comes. I want, you know, so that really speaks to, I know I appreciate you as advocates for this, you know, please speak to our communities, celebrities, and everyone else needs to be speaking about the importance of vaccines so we can save lives. And I know this is a bit different from what the last speaker said. You know, she kept saying vaccines save lives, But really, let's take it a little bit further, because again, as we're learning, if you have the vaccine and the people don't come for it, they don't get vaccinated, they don't get the shot, it is not going to save their life. It will only save your life if you actually get vaccinated. So I think it's important for us to always remember that it's not just having the vaccine, it's the access to the vaccine, it's receiving the vaccine, having the shot, and in this case, having the 2 shots for you to be protected. Then the other thing that I was asked to talk about was around the funding and the infrastructure, but I think this has been covered in many ways because there are a lot of different organizations, as you can see here, that have put money, again, as donation, not as loan, but as donation, so funding into COVAX and other groups for them to be able to do the research that is necessary to produce the drugs and treatment, diagnostics, and the vaccines that we would need for COVID-19. This is just a quote that I got from offline from the Gavi CEO, where they are actually willing to give up to 42 million to 30 different countries to do a number of things that we've been discussing. So the funding is there. I think we know that we are all in this together, and we have to put as much resources as we can so that we can go back to some level of normalcy sooner than later. And then related to infrastructure and linking this up to some of the work that I do, as you heard, I work for the African Academy of Sciences, which is based in Nairobi. And one of the things that I lead is a clinical trials platform, basically, which tries to make sure that pharmaceutical companies identify Africa as part of the globe and work with us in terms of the clinical trials, because it's important that we participate in clinical trials. If you remember from my first slide, we talked about safe and effective. We can't be entirely sure that a vaccine will be safe and effective for our people if we don't participate in the clinical trials. That data is necessary for people to be able to make the decision of whether it is safe or effective for a particular group of people. For example, we've heard a few things about allergies with regards to the Pfizer vaccine. And that's a very unique population of people that have extreme allergies that are being affected by that. But it took a number of people with allergies to be vaccinated for us to know that. Same thing with many other things. If we don't participate, it's hard for us to determine whether something is safe and effective for us. And so to allow conversations and engagement with pharmaceutical companies, we've set up the clinical trials community platform where individuals or pharmaceutical companies and other sponsors can access different sites across Africa to be able to engage the continent in conducting this trial, so that we know what vaccines work best for us and move those forward. But I just wanted to highlight this because it's more in regard to what you guys do. So on that platform, we have a forum for discussion, and we encourage community members, and this is very specific to the African continent. We encourage people to go on there. As you can see, you can click on COVID-19 and you can find information about COVID-19 and have conversations, ask questions that you might have. And those who manage it will do our best to answer your questions. And to get to that, you can find us on www.ctc.africa. So that's one resource that we have tried to put together with the African Academy of Sciences with regard to contributing to increased access of COVID vaccines for the African continent. And with that, I just want to end by saying that, this too shall pass. And thanks for listening. And I will take any more questions in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maroa, for your incredible and very informative presentation. As you know, I think, access to vaccines is a very important conversation that we need to have. Global access is important, and we need to think about ways in which we enable, or the geopolitical actions or how the world works affects whether or not which countries get vaccines. And with that, there are questions that I'd like to start with. There's a question from Edith Kamau. She's asking, what is hearing COVID-19? Okay, I don't understand the first part. I'll just go on to the second part. Are those who are tested for COVID-19 really free from the virus? There are countries that claim that they're coming up with a vaccine. What measures are put in place to ensure that the best vaccine and the safest vaccine is used? That's the first question, Dr. Maroa. The second one is from Margarita Como, who says, how long should it take for the first shot to the second one when a health worker is administering a vaccine on a patient?
Okay. So to the first question, I think the question was around making sure that the best vaccines are used. I think we alluded to this previously. There are very stringent processes of getting any healthcare products to the people. So vaccines and drugs and diagnostics all have to go through what we call clinical trials. That's why I'm saying that if clinical trials are in your neighborhood and they're looking for people, if you want to participate, it's a good way of being part of this bigger solution. And so within that, once they have been shown to be safe and effective, they still have to go through what we call regulatory agencies. And the regulators are like our, what can I call them? They are like the observers. They just want to make sure that it's the right thing that is being done and that it's the data that you're presenting. So these pharmaceutical companies have to present the data to convince the regulators that the data are actually safe. So they must have tested this in the right population. They must have tested this in an inclusive population, is what I was trying to allude to. So that means, Black or white communities, rich and poor, diverse demographics, so that they can then say that this data is representative of the general population. And therefore, if the data looks good, then the regulators can approve whether that vaccine goes through. And then there was a question to do with how long after the first shot should people receive the second shot. That depends on what vaccine you receive. For the Pfizer, I think it's 3 weeks, so about 22 days. For the Moderna one, it's about 27 days, so it's a little bit longer. I'm not entirely sure about the AstraZeneca one, but the important thing to remember is that until you get your second shot, you are not fully protected. The first shot simply just kind of stimulates the body and gives it the first kind of stimulation for it to start generating the right responses. And I don't want to get into the science of it really, but the second shot is the one that boosts that from about 50% to what they say is about 94%. And again, remember, we also have to remember that for both the Pfizer, for example, and the Moderna, it is 94% of the people that had taken it that seem to be protected. So there's 5%, let's not forget that there's 5% of people that might still receive the vaccine and still have maybe a severe disease. Really, it's always good to be open about these things, because it's not 100%, at least we haven't gotten these vaccines to 100%, but 94, 95% is pretty good for a vaccine that has been developed within a year. Over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maroa. There are 2 other questions that I'll read out for you. Lynette Mabote asks and says, thank you and congratulations on a rich and amazing presentation. When should we realistically anticipate to have access to any of these vaccines in some of our African countries? We know, particularly here in South Africa, we're receiving our first dose as of next week, Monday, where it will be landing from India. But what about other African countries? And secondly, are there any concerns around shelf life when the vaccines reach the central medical stores in countries? And I think what Lynette is alluding to here, Dr. Maroa, is around some of the vaccine storages. They require super freeze, and we do not have the infrastructure in Africa. Can you please talk about also how the lack of infrastructure in African countries or in other global South countries, such as the ones in Africa, could be a hindrance in accessing COVID-19 vaccines?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I want to start with the first one. When do we realistically expect these vaccines to reach Africa? As I said, COVAX is ready to start or are looking at sending us their first doses next month. So for the countries that are part of COVAX, I think maybe the plans should be underway on how they receive their vaccines next month. So maybe we should give it up to March latest, that this should start trickling into the continent. But as I said again, there are other bilateral conversations. I know, like, I come from Kenya, and I know that the minister did say that they are having conversations and they bought extra doses. So hopefully those also start flowing in. But again, because of the infrastructures we've discussed, it's probably going to take a little bit of a while before they actually bring them to the ground. I think it's important to note that even the United States, with its infrastructure, when the vaccines became available, it became apparent that they did not actually have a very good distribution network. And we've had situations where the vaccines have sat in cold rooms for days when people are actually waiting to be vaccinated. So you can only imagine what it's going to look like when we come to Africa. So the infrastructure, as I said, part of the infrastructure has been improved over the past few years by Gavi, because it has this mandate of distributing vaccines, childhood vaccines, to different parts of different countries to the very last mile. But I don't think that's going to be sufficient. So I think it's going to call upon, as we wait for the vaccines to be distributed from the manufacturing plants, my hope is that countries are actually investing in this. And that's why it's really important for us not to just talk about access as a problem due to cost. Yes, the cost might be a problem, but you could buy these vaccines, but if you don't have the right infrastructure to take it to where it's supposed to be, then that's going to be a problem. So I think we can leverage on the infrastructure from Gavi. We can leverage from infrastructure that other programs I've used in the past. I would imagine other global health programs have infrastructure that can be leveraged on. And I think this is, because we can't start from scratch right now, this is going to be how most countries are going to manage this. It's by speaking to any other programs that have existed in the past and infrastructure that has been built in the past, whether it's for HIV or TB or any other vaccine program, for us to be able to move this forward. I know that PATH, for example, has a lot of vaccination efforts in Africa. So PATH could be one of those organizations that countries probably would want to speak to figure out what's available and what can be leveraged on, so that we can have this distribution a lot more seamlessly. But I can see how this is going to be a bit of a frustration in coming days.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maroa. Another question is regarding clinical trials. Before we even get a vaccine or have access to a vaccine, we would need to do clinical trials. Why are so few clinical trials being done in Africa, not just in the context of COVID-19, but historically as well? But obviously today we're talking about it. And what can the activists and the community leaders who are listening to you this evening, or whatever time it is in the time zones they are in, how can they think about access from a point of view of even clinical trials are not done on the continent?
I love who has asked that question, because that's what keeps me awake. And that's why I put in the last slides that talk about the clinical trial community. That's the exact gap that we are trying to fill by building that platform. Why aren't enough clinical trials being done on the continent? This is what they told us when we had engagements with major sponsors. They said that the continent basically they don't know exactly where to go to find the right capacity, the right infrastructure for them to do their work. So that was one reason that they gave. The second major reason was regulatory and ethics intelligence or infrastructure. And we've alluded to this many times because I've mentioned to you that for a clinical trial, even to start, the regulators first have to be able to say, yes, this looks ethical, because they have to look to see what exactly are these people proposing to do? What is this product they want to try? Is it even nearly safe for our people, and so on and so forth. And then they need to approve that. But for that to happen, sponsors have to send them their protocol. Regulators have to read through it. Regulators have to send them comments or reviews, and then they have to tell them, oh, we don't like this, maybe this is not ethical, or this is not good for our cultural group, or whatever it is. And then, so there has to be some feedback loop before they finally approve this study to start. But if sponsors don't know exactly where this information is or exactly whom to send their protocol to, they are not going to go out of their way to do it, because for pharmaceutical companies, unfortunately, it's all about time and profit. So the systems need to be predictable enough for them so that they can gauge what their risk is and be able to make decisions up or given that. So we are trying to fill that gap so that hopefully in the future, accessing this kind of information can be easy for sponsors so that they can actually bring more trials to the continent, and absolutely more trials over and above just COVID-19. We want more trials on the continent for the very reasons that I've mentioned previously. So what the platform is doing is that we are bringing together all the clinical trials on the continent. We are asking all clinical trial sites on the continent to sign up on our page. So think about it like a Facebook kind of, but for clinical trials, where people come on there, they write their profile, they say, I'm Dr. Jenniffer Mabuka, I'm based in Nairobi, I conduct clinical trials in HIV. If you're interested in conducting a trial in Kenya, contact me because this is my area of interest, or in cancer or whatever. And then we are also asking regulators and national regulatory agencies to also sign up and tell us where do they want these proposals to be dropped off? How much does it cost? How long is it going to take for them to look at this? And what is the feedback loop like? And what else needs to be done? So by providing the necessary information for the sponsors to be able to make this big decision of whether they want to conduct a trial in one country versus another, we hope that we will be able to attract more trials to the continent. And these are ongoing conversations from my program with the African Academy of Sciences and a number of key pharmaceutical companies around the globe.
Thank you for that. And just to also add on to that question, Dr. Maroa, if we do get to a place where we have the infrastructure to have clinical trials and to host clinical trials in our countries, does that also mean that does our ability to host clinical trials mean we automatically have access to the vaccines when they become available?
That's a great question. And yes, I don't want us to say that when we have the infrastructure to conduct trials, because we do have the infrastructure to conduct trials. We need to improve on it. We need to, I think that actually the biggest challenge is we need to kind of distribute it evenly across the continent, because right now, majority of it is in South Africa and Egypt and a few other countries. There are countries that are silent. So we need, as a team, as an African Union kind of bloc, we need to make sure everyone grows as the rest of us do. And we have excellent scientists on the continent that can manage and conduct trials. That's absolutely not a question. So it's just making them more visible and making sure that people know that we are there, that we have the resources, and there are people that are able to conduct these trials. And then to your second part of the comment is that, yes, this is supposed to be ethically, and that is what's one of the things that the regulators look at. We need, when a sponsor comes in, we need to be able to say that, once this trial ends, if it was a trial on maybe a malaria drug, that malaria drug should be available to the community that participated at a lower price or something. I mean, there has to be a benefit to the communities that participate. That's how we make trials ethical. Otherwise, if we don't have that kind of a benefit, then it basically becomes a situation where communities feel like they're being used and not gaining from those particular engagements with sponsors. So yes, we need to look at these proposals very well, and there has to be very clearly defined benefits to the community, whether it's that particular drug or maybe a different drug that the community would appreciate. Because again, we have to think about it, like, you don't want to give me a drug for malaria if I come from a country where malaria is not a problem, right? You want to give me a drug that I can actually use. So all those things need to be considered when we are having these conversations.
Thank you for that. And another question that's coming in the Q&A box is, will the vaccines we have now on SARS-CoV-2 variant, the mutations that are happening, will the vaccines work? And we've seen these variants in SA, in South Africa, in the UK, and in Brazil. Or we will need to have vaccine boosters to deal with these emerging strains?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I was in a meeting yesterday where we were having this conversation, and the honest truth is that we don't know for sure what the impact is going to be on the responses to the vaccines that we currently have. There is some indication that the variant from South Africa seems to be causing a problem, and that means it is reducing the ability of the antibodies to actually neutralize it. Because I don't want to get too scientific, sorry. But so the variant from South Africa for sure seems to be, it seems as if it might be a problem. The one from the UK so far, I don't have any data that I'm aware of, at least. And so I think, one, let's wait for more data, and I think that's going to come in the next few weeks. We should have enough data to be able to say that conclusively. And then two, if the preliminary data from South Africa is anything to go by, then it means that yes, we might have to think about ways of altering the vaccine as we move forward. So it might be more like what we do for the flu vaccine, because the flu vaccine, we have to make a new one every year, depending on what variant is circulating. So it's not what we would want it to be, but it looks like it might turn out to be that way. But we are, hopefully we, fingers crossed and praying about it, that it doesn't get worse than it is right now.
Thank you. And also when we talk about access, we have to talk about the inequalities that may exist, right, between the different countries, whereas developed countries, as they like to call themselves, or the global north and the global south countries, where it might be harder. What can be done in terms of how could we use science to ensure equitable access? So, for example, I'm remembering a quote by the man who discovered the polio vaccine. Is like, would you patent the sun? Trying to show that had he patented the polio vaccine, probably we would not have been able to eradicate polio today, in present day today. So how do we balance the social justice element of equitable access with how do we bridge that into the scientific field where vaccines are developed?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think some of the examples that we've given, for example, the issues around HIV and drug access really got everyone thinking about, potential issues that in the past probably had just been, swept under the carpet, and people were not wanting to talk about them. But I think, to be honest, I'm very optimistic, because we are having these conversations now, which we were not having previously. And, making it possible, or working with pharmaceutical companies and them being able to listen to us, which hasn't been happening in the past, I think is a step forward. So making sure that we understand, as we started this conversation, we talked about making sure that we understand that it would be unethical for us to not have systems in place, guidelines in place, processes in place for everybody to receive a vaccine for whichever disease when it's available. And so we need to make sure that we are engaging with the right institutions, so to speak. So whether it's the African Union or whichever group that probably heads the pharmaceutical companies, but the conversations need to be continuous. I think the conversations need to be continuous, and the key stakeholders need to be engaging. And that's why for me, it was quite exciting to see that when COVAX was formed, it is not just pharmaceutical companies and governments, it's civil society, it's the philanthropists. Everybody needs to be at the table to say what they think needs to be paid attention to. Because as a scientist, I might not be looking at the world from the view that an advocacy person is looking at it. And they need to remind me that, oh, you know what, this is happening. And so if we don't move together as a group represented by all these different stakeholders, then we will go wrong. But I think acknowledging that and putting people into the same room and listening to each other, I think is going to be very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Maroa. And I think we have our 3 last comments and questions. Give us Nimubona thanking you for your presentation and saying that this is very important and he really appreciates it. I obviously echo his sentiments. George Amondi asking, this is more of a scientific question around vaccines, and it is important we ask these questions as well, because this is what allows for activists and community leaders to understand what to advocate for. So George Amondi is asking, how do we go about the myths and misconceptions on vaccines? Even for me as a journalist, but also just as a person who lives in a community, and I'm the go-to person for many people in my family around vaccines. Yeah. So I get sent WhatsApps about the most outrageous things. How do we break down the scientific knowledge so that people understand what is a vaccine and that there is no 5G, there is no poison, it's not going to alter your DNA? And then I'll come to the 2 last questions so that you can take that one.
Yeah, so messaging around vaccines can be a challenge, again, because of course it's complex, it's science and all. But I think we just need to find simple examples to be able to explain to our families, the importance of vaccines. For example, and I know the speaker that was before me talked about polio. Polio, Africa was just recently, I think it's around October, declared polio-free. It's because of the vaccines, okay? We all know what polio is capable of doing. We have colleagues, I have a friend who's a doctor that suffered polio and he walks on crutches. So, I mean, that's an excellent example that, if we don't have vaccines for polio, those are things that are likely to happen. And then the other example is smallpox. Some of the younger generation, I don't know what my audience looks like and how old they are, but some of the younger generation did not even receive the smallpox shot. I think my age mates are kind of the last people that received that, because after that it was declared free. There was no need for people to receive the smallpox shot. The thing is that so we need to be able to link the benefits of the vaccine so that people can actually have an idea of why they need to take it, and even bring them to the Western world, as you call them, global North, or whatever we want to call them. There are anti-vaxxers here, but even within those groups of anti-vaxxers, whenever there's a measles outbreak, their children are the ones who suffer, because there are communities that don't want to vaccinate their children, but when measles comes around, their children die. And the people that are vaccinated, their children, life goes on. So, we need to be able to pull out these things. In terms of, will it alter their DNA? No, it is not going to alter their DNA. I think this one is with respect to the current mRNA vaccines for Pfizer and Moderna. It is not going to alter their DNA, because we know that the way it works, and I don't want to get into too much of the science, is that the mRNA does not even get to the nucleus where your DNA sits. It will just get to the outer part of the cell, will be processed into proteins that look like the virus, and then go back to the surface of the cell to be able to stimulate the body in a similar manner as it would have happened if it was an actual infection. So there's no single time when that mRNA product is going to get to your nucleus to change your DNA at all. No, it is not going to happen. That said, however, we do acknowledge that this is the first time we are using this technology, and therefore, over the next months, it's definitely going to be important for more data to be collected and communities to be spoken to so that they become more confident about the people that have taken these vaccines, how are they faring on. And I have a number of friends who have already been vaccinated, who are in the healthcare field, who have already been vaccinated with both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. So yeah, I mean, I totally understand the challenge of trying to speak to our communities about this, but the bottom line remains that some of us would probably not be here if it's not for vaccines.
Thank you so much, Doc. And as I'm saying the last question, more questions keep coming in. As you're speaking about anti-vaxxers, I'm remembering a quote from a former boss of mine in a newsroom. He said that we need to remember that vaccines are social contracts. You don't take a vaccine necessarily just for yourself, but you take it because you are protecting everyone else around you. And we could even say masks have become social contracts as well, because we don't wear the mask to protect ourselves, but we wear it to protect people against us in the case that we may be infected with COVID-19. A question that's coming up, two questions. Do you think, how do you feel, or what do you think that big pharma or pharmaceutical companies have been transparent in its dealings during the pandemic? And another question is around what policies or policy do you regard as a barrier to access, especially when we're thinking on the African continent? Barriers to access to vaccines, in this case, COVID-19 vaccines.
I don't know if there are specific policies that are related to COVID-19 really, but I would say generally, when we start talking about trade, which is, one of the things that led to the HIV issues that we were discussing earlier, is that, there's the patenting aspect of it. You have this vaccine, you patent it, you can't make a generic of it until a point X. That is what I struggle with. I mean, that shouldn't be how we run business, really. Again, if a product or a tool is approved, I think it should be made available to everybody across the world. If a generic of it can be able to save lives and can be affordable to majority of the countries, I think that should be also made available to those countries that want to go with the generic aspect of it. So that part, I think, should be relaxed, at least for the COVID-19 about patenting. So, like for example, Pfizer should be able to let companies in India produce those vaccines probably at a cheaper price and send them to low and middle income countries that can afford them to buy them from China. That's just my personal perspective. But I'm going to say that I have to go. I had another meeting. So I maybe we take another couple minutes and then I have to drop off.
Okay, no, I think we are almost done with the questions, and just to add on to the barriers of access because of policies, there has been, like you keep referring to the HIV era, and as somebody who grew up in South Africa and became a health journalist, learning about that the fight that advocates were at the forefront of fighting for access to antiretrovirals in South Africa, when some pharmaceutical companies were trying to strong arm our government into leaving current patent laws in their favor. It was activists, it was scientists that showed that even illegally at that time brought in ARVs into the country to help HIV positive South Africans. And so when we think about this, lastly, Doc, the last question here, what is the top policy and access issue that civil society and advocates need to address urgently when it comes to global access for COVID-19 vaccines?
Yeah, again, I would still emphasize the one on patenting, as you've said, because I think for me, that's the most challenging one in terms of we need to be able to have access to them at that level. I mean, everything else, I think, falls back to our countries and how we manage and prepare ourselves to deliver once it arrives. But we need to be able to purchase it. We need to be able to purchase it in large numbers. And so if COVAX is going to be able to do X amount of work, then the rest of the work is going to have to be done by government. And if it turns out, and I hope not, but if it turns out that we will need vaccines like the flu one, like, yearly or every 2 years or whatever, then it means that we need to be thinking about these things long term, and we can't keep going back to COVAX. We have to find ways in which different countries can easily have a bilateral arrangement with a manufacturing company at an affordable price that then they can deliver the right doses to the right countries at the right time.
Thank you so much. And I think we will leave it there, especially because you have, I know, just to tell everyone who is watching, Dr. Maroa is based in Seattle. So this is the beginning of her day. Many of us, myself included, we are ending our Thursday. She is beginning hers. Thank you so much, Dr. Maroa, for indulging us, entertaining us, but also informing us about these complexities of global access when it comes to COVID-19, how scientists and activists can work together to advocate for equitable access for vaccines and other life-saving drugs and treatments across the world, particularly for the global south. As we think about some of the issues that were raised here, I think it's important that we also familiarize ourselves with or hold pharmaceutical companies accountable for the profit, for how they are driven by profits and how greedy they can become at times. And that it is not just our governments or our scientists that have the answers or the solutions, but it is a collaborative effort from governments, from these pharmaceutical companies, as well as scientists from across the world. Thank you again. Please be reminded that this was the first 2 lectures, and tomorrow at 4 p.m. South African time, we will start with Dr. Sibusiso Mkhwananzi as she tells us, or she presents to us about the non-pharmaceutical interventions for COVID-19. Today we're talking about the pharmaceutical ones a lot. Tomorrow we're going to talk about what does it look like when we're preventing COVID-19 without drugs, and what are some of the issues, challenges, and implications for that. She will then be followed by Dr. Samukeliso Dube, who will be taking us again through the basic science of COVID-19, how it's transmitted, how transmission works, everything that we want to know, the nitty-gritty stuff about the science behind the virus itself. We will hear about it tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to both our speakers, Dr. Nyaradzo and Dr. Maroa, who have indulged us and entertained us. Thank you to all of you who've asked these incredible questions that have left us thinking more and thinking deeper about the issues that our countries and our communities face when it comes to COVID-19. We will start promptly tomorrow at 4 p.m. Have a good evening, have a good morning, and stay safe.